It's 3 a.m. on a French road, August 1944. Private First Class Curtis Cullin, 22 years old, sharecropper's son from Mississippi, can't see more than 30 feet ahead. His headlights are taped down to slits, blackout conditions, and the GMC CCKW under him is running hot, loaded past its rated 2.5-ton limit with artillery shells, jerrycans of gasoline, and cases of K rations stacked to the canvas top. He hasn't slept in 36 hours. The road is cratered. And somewhere behind him, a column of 80 trucks is trying to keep up. He doesn't stop. He can't stop. 200 miles ahead, General George Patton's Third Army is running on fumes, literally. Tanks with empty fuel tanks lined up along roads in France, waiting. The fastest armored advance in the history of warfare had outrun its own supply chain. And the only thing standing between Patton's momentum and a complete halt was a fleet of trucks, a color-coded route system, and roughly 23,000 men willing to drive themselves to the edge. This is the story of the Red Ball Express. When the Allies broke out of Normandy in late July 1944, nobody was fully prepared for how fast things would move. Operation Cobra cracked the German line open. Patton's tanks poured through the gap. Within days, armored columns were racing across France at speeds the planners had never modeled. Was the logistical system, built around a slow, grinding advance, collapsed almost immediately. The port of Cherbourg was still being repaired. The pipeline infrastructure didn't exist yet. Railroad lines were bombed out. Everything the Army needed, fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, medical supplies, had to move on wheels. By August 21st, the situation was critical enough that Lieutenant General John C. H. Lee authorized the creation of an emergency motor transport operation. They called it the Red Ball Express, borrowing the old American railroad term for priority freight. The shipments too important to wait. The name fit. Nothing in the European theater was more urgent. The routes were simple in concept. One road north for loaded trucks heading to the front. One road south for empties returning to the depots near the Normandy beaches. Red ball signs, a painted circle, red on white, marked every junction. Military police stood at intersections around the clock. Civilian traffic was banned entirely. The express had the road to itself, which was both a necessity and, in the dark hours, an eerie kind of loneliness. The trucks were GMC CCKWs, the legendary deuce and a half, a 6x6, a 2.5-ton cargo truck that had been in production since 1941 and would become the backbone of Allied motorized logistics, roughly 18 feet long, powered by a 270 cubic inch 6-cylinder engine making about 91 horsepower, capable of around 45 miles per hour on a good road. The deuce and a half wasn't glamorous, it wasn't fast, but it was dependable. It could handle rough terrain, and it existed in enormous numbers. The Army had them, and the Army needed every single one. At its peak in late August and early September, the Red Ball Express ran 140 convoys per day, using nearly 6,000 vehicles and more than 23,000 drivers. The route stretched approximately 700 miles round trip. The official speed limit was 25 miles per hour on the open road. Slow enough to keep the convoys together, fast enough to cover ground. Trucks were supposed to maintain a 60-yard gap. In daylight, that was manageable. And at night, with taped headlights and exhausted drivers, 60 yards felt like faith. See that subscribe button? It's our exchange. Your way of saying, "This reached me." not about the action's size, but its meaning. Hit it if this resonated, drop a like if it moved you, and comment your thoughts on this story. Let's complete this circle together. What most people don't know, what history books skipped over for decades, is who was actually doing the driving. And approximately 75% of the Red Ball Express drivers were African American soldiers drawn from units that the segregated U.S. Army had deemed unsuitable for combat. Quartermaster truck companies, transportation corps battalions. These were the assignments given to black soldiers when the Army didn't know what else to do with them. The irony is brutal and precise. The men the Army considered unfit to fight were the men keeping the Army's fighters alive. Said Corporal James Rucard from Detroit, Private Amos Johnson from Georgia, Sergeant John Houston from Alabama. They drove through German artillery zones, through Luftwaffe strafing runs, through roads that turned to mud after rain and to choking dust in the heat. They weren't given combat infantry pay. Many weren't given adequate food. Some units ran so short on spare parts that drivers cannibalized wrecked trucks on the roadside to keep their own running, reporting the repairs themselves and continuing on without waiting for authorization. The physical toll was staggering. Drivers reported hallucinating from sleep deprivation, seeing trees move, imagining other vehicles that weren't there. Some fell asleep at the wheel and drove off the road. Accidents were common enough that convoy commanders began assigning a second man to cab duty specifically to watch the driver. You could sleep, but someone else had to stay awake. And the truck never stopped. Maintenance crews worked in shifts, changing tires, adjusting brakes, topping off oil and coolant. A deuce and a half under red ball conditions burned through tires at a ferocious rate. The front tires on a loaded truck doing sustained highway speeds wore down faster than the supply chain could reliably replace them. Some drivers ran underinflated tires rather than wait for replacements, which worked, until it didn't. By mid-September, the Red Ball Express had delivered approximately 412,000 tons of supplies to the front. Patton's army had fuel. The advance continued. Brussels fell. The German border came into view. But the express itself was beginning to show cracks. The roads, French rural routes not built for this kind of sustained heavy traffic, were deteriorating badly. Trucks were being worn out faster than they could be replaced, as the supply line had lengthened so much that a round trip now took multiple days, meaning fewer deliveries per vehicle per week. The original math was falling apart. On November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express officially ceased operations. By then, the Allies had repaired enough railroad lines and opened enough ports, most critically, Antwerp in Belgium, that the emergency truck relay was no longer necessary. As the crisis had passed, the trucks had bought the time needed to build something more sustainable. 83 days. That's how long the Red Ball Express ran. In those 83 days, roughly 6,000 trucks and tens of thousands of drivers moved the equivalent of what a major railroad yard handles in months, doing it on roads that were never designed for the job, as under conditions that would have shut down any peacetime trucking operation in an afternoon. The men who drove those routes came home to a country that wasn't ready to acknowledge what they'd done. The segregated army had given them the mission nobody else wanted. They'd executed it at a level that changed the outcome of the war in Western Europe. For years, their names appeared in no monuments, no major films, no school curricula worth mentioning. And that has begun to change. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans holds extensive documentation on the Red Ball Express, including photographs, unit records, and oral histories collected before the last drivers passed away. A monument in Chartres, France, one of the key waypoints on the express route, recognizes the operation. Several of the GMC CCKWs that survived the war are preserved in military vehicle collections across the United States. Yes, their olive drab paint a little too clean now, their canvas too tight. Nothing like the road-worn machines that rattled through French darkness in August 1944. The Deuce and a Half itself kept working long after the war ended, serving in Korea, Vietnam, and dozens of other conflicts. Versions of it remained in active U.S. military service into the 1990s. The basic design, rugged, simple, and capable of running when everything around it was falling apart, turned out to be exactly what the 20th century kept needing. There's a photograph, taken somewhere in France in September 1944, of a driver asleep across his steering wheel. The truck is parked on a dirt shoulder. A jerrycan is lashed to the running board. The man's hands are still loosely gripping the wheel, even in sleep, as if some part of him knows he'll need to move again in minutes. His name isn't recorded. His unit isn't visible in the frame. He's just a man and his truck, somewhere between the coast and the front, resting in the only way the Red Ball Express allowed. That photograph is the whole story. The truck doesn't stop. You rest when you can, for as long as you're given, and then you drive. And drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if you've ever driven a route that felt like it had no end, you already understand something about what these men knew.